Okay, everyone, thank you for joining us for today's University of Texas Energy Symposium for October 29th, 2024. I'm Kerry King, research scientist and assistant director here at the Energy Institute, the sponsor of the UT Energy Symposium. And before I introduce today's speaker, I will point out some upcoming talks. Next week on Tuesday, Election Day, we will have a talk on the state of energy in Mexico from Ariel Ramos, who is a founding partner of a law firm focusing on Mexico, and he's on the International Board of Advisors for the University of Texas at Austin. Then on November 12th, we will have Destiny Knock from Carnegie Mellon University, and she will talk about engineering and social justice in the context of energy and energy poverty in households. But today, it is my pleasure to introduce Joe Kiesecker. He's the lead scientist of the Nature Conservancy. Title of his talk is The Road to Renewable Energy Transition Must Pass Through Crowded Lands. A little bit of background on Joe. He's a recognized scientific leader in energy siting and mitigation, and his work has changed the way that governments and industry respond to environmental impacts from development. He's been at the forefront of recognizing that as we transition to renewable energy, we must advance smarter approaches for development and the environment so that meeting climate goals does not come at the expense of human development or healthy lands and waters. And he's documented this in his recent book, Energy Sprawl Solutions, Balancing Global Development and Conservation. He's well published, of course, as a lead scientist. He's published in Nature, Science, Proceedings in the National Academy of Sciences. And prior to being at the Conservancy, he was a professor at Penn State University. I'll read only part of his abstract today, but the significance of renewable energy in achieving necessary reductions in emissions to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius is widely acknowledged. However, there's a concern growing over the allocation of land for constructing the required new infrastructure. Nowhere is this conflict more apparent than in many of our top emitting countries, where renewable energy targets are ambitious and land use conflicts are already significant. So although renewable energy can provide the solution to both the world's growing need for cheap energy and climate mitigation, sustainable future of renewable energy is far from simple due to its land use impacts and sociological risk. So that is what Joe Kiesecker is going to speak with us today. I will now hand it over to Joe. And as always, please submit your questions as you have them via the question and answer feature of Zoom or online on YouTube. And I will interject during Joe's talk as seems appropriate, or hold the questions until the end. So with that said, Joe, the floor is yours. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Kerry. And it is it's a pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate the opportunity. Before I get rolling, I just want to acknowledge a few of the people that have been involved with the work that I'll be talking about. In particular, a bunch of these studies were led by others, so I want to just throw out a few names, acknowledge them. On my team, Jim Oakleaf, Case Oshie, Mike Heiner, Jeff Evans, Aishwarya Bhattacharjee, and then other folks from our TNC program. So, for example, in India's program, Shiva, Nupur, Vishnu, and Anand all played a really important role in this work. And then I'll be talking a little bit about our work in Europe. And so the gang from our Nature Conservancy Southeast Europe program, Dragana, Igor, Cassandra, Tiana, and Mate, again, really want to acknowledge all the help and effort they put in on all this work. And then, of course, all the stakeholders. We're talking about projects that were jointly co-designed with stakeholders in those countries and in those regions. And then, a lot of other folks that were involved. So with that said, I'm going to dive in. And I think a lot of this stuff I'll say early on is stuff that's probably, fresh in your minds, but climate change is clearly the defining issue of our time. And we're at a defining moment. The fingerprints of climate change can already be detected. Temperatures are rising. The last summer will be the coolest summer that you'll experience for the rest of your life. Drought and wildfires are starting to occur more frequently. Rainfall patterns are shifting. Glaciers and snow are melting, and the global mean sea level is rising. We do know that increasing CO2 levels play a key role in that warming, and that the majority of emissions come from the use of fossil fuels in our energy system, approximately about 70%. So to address climate change, it becomes an energy challenge. And I know that's all, like I said, stuff that you know, but it gives a little framing for why TNC is focused on this. Um, Many people believe in climate change, but still don't really think about it or consider what should be done about it. Now, the psychological research around some of this, the climate denial, tells us that much of the time, climate change is such a large and scary idea to understand, and people use denial as a defense mechanism. Ultimately, what that's leading to is that the levels of investment we need to address the issue are woefully under where we need to be at. So unfortunately, though, today I'm going to add another layer to this challenge, and that's the land use challenges associated with the renewable energy transition. But it's one place where I think we have the tools that we need. We just need to apply them and get them moving forward. All right, so the build out challenge. We need a lot of renewables. Right now, the majority of that is going to consist of wind and solar, and they need a lot of land. The land footprint associated with wind and solar are typically larger than fossil fuel sources. And so, again, a lot of land that's needed. Um, because of that, we have the potential for conflicts between current land use and um, and that new energy development that's needed. It's that concern that is really what we're trying to address, is try to pre-think how we address some of those land use challenges so that they don't create conflicts, so that the transition can move forward. Just want to be really painfully clear. We're not, we are very pro renewable energy. In fact, we are turning our conservation planning tools on their head to help figure out ways to guide that wind and solar development and move it forward. One of the positives from this work is, regardless how we look at this, whether we're looking globally, regionally, at a country level, or even at a landscape level, there's usually orders of magnitude more lower conflict land than we need. And this is actually from a global analysis that was looking only at a narrow lens of sort of environmental features, but we estimated, based on what was needed to achieve the Paris Climate Accord commitments to 2030, they're about 17 times the amount of land needed to meet those wind and solar goals. And pretty much universally, almost all the top emitting countries could do that, with a few exceptions here and there globally. So very positive message. Unfortunately, when we start to look at how development is playing out, we see that in many cases, it's targeting higher conflict land cover types. So we built a tool with Microsoft and Planet. The work originally started in India because we need to know the locations of wind and solar arrays, because we use it as an input to predictive model that helps us understand where development is likely to go. And so once we built that for India and we started to look at the patterns associated with it, we were like, okay, we need to turn this AI that was focused originally just on solar to both wind and solar, and do it globally. And so that's what we did. And the analysis is soon to be released. At least you can go to the site and you can actually access it, but you have to get a password. It's a little bit cumbersome. Soon it's going to be open access. So anyone can go play with the data and help us improve it. It's an AI, so it'll make mistakes for sure. When we start to look at those patterns, again, as I said, we're in many cases, wind and solar development are targeting high conflict land cover types. This is actually a preliminary model from Brazil, and one of the areas that's being impacted are forested areas. So in this case, broadleaf deciduous forests. The other, though, is also agriculture. So leading driver of deforestation in the Amazon, as you know, is agricultural expansion. And so if we're targeting renewable energy on agricultural lands, we're likely to displace some of the agricultural development and maybe compound the loss of forests in the Amazon and other places like Cerrado and all the places that are being impacted by agricultural expansion. So with that in mind, we have been really thinking about how a planning approach that can start to address the conflicts, avoid those conflicts, and really help identify areas that will be low conflict for energy development. One of the things that's at the core of this work is something we call development by design. And really what that recognizes is the way we plan for development is fundamentally broken. So we plan for projects one by one. So we don't think about the impacts of of a wind farm or a solar array until someone proposes that development. And what we're trying to do is get ahead of that. So project where the potential is, and in this case, try to proactively identify where low conflict areas would be that still have what wind and solar need, but also don't have the social or the environmental values. Identify those places, and then think about policy, finance mechanisms that will help drive development to those places. So this is just a schematic that'll walk us through this process. First is really to consider, what does energy need? And we are an environmental conservation organization, but we spend a lot of time thinking about development footprints, particularly on my team. For wind and solar, that's going to be like, what are the biophysical and land use constraints and resource thresholds, wind speeds, solar iridescence, and again, those other biophysical constraints. Once we have some of that universe mapped, we then look at, okay, what are the things that actually influence development? One of the big ones for renewables is access to transmission. It can also be proximity to load centers. And obviously the timing of when wind blows versus when the demand is there. But so to bring in some of those feasibility criteria. So then we have some idea, okay, these are the places where, is going to be economically viable for wind and or solar. Then we start to think about things, okay, what are some of the legal exclusions, the protected areas? Maybe there are areas that are important for ecosystem services, such as flood prevention. So, we're not going to want to build a lot of wind in the floodplains. A lot of times these are different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So, in the US, that's clearly the case, state by state, but even at state level, those can vary county to county. So we try to bring some of those in depending on the scale of the analysis. Typically, the ones that do have those legal exclusions, we want to make sure they're included. Then we start to think about some of the environmental conservation values. And often these don't have teeth, although there can with, in the US with the Endangered Species Act. But in other countries, no, that's not the case. So we are looking sort of kind of the inputs that we typically use for a conservation planning exercise, what we call the coarse filter and fine filter. Coarse filter being ecological communities, fine filter being species. So we want, where are those ecological communities and ecosystems that are in good condition, where are rare ecological systems, and the same for species. Species that are in decline or endemic species, or species that have other conservation concern. This is our kind of bread and butter at TNC. It's systematic conservation planning to guide all of our conservation investments. Next, and I think probably the biggest hurdle, is the social conservation values and what communities want or don't want. So, there's desktop data that we can pull in, historical or religious sites, how dependent local communities are on local land. I'll talk a little bit about in how we use census data in India. Areas that are important for tourism or recreation. So in West Texas, we built view sheds that were based off of where people were taking pictures, and then filtered those based on the ones that were looking at values for nature, and those can be things that can guide information that we bring into decision support tools. Once we have all that, then we can start to look at, okay, how much land do we have that's quote unquote lower conflict, and how does that meet the targets that are needed? We can use that to start to generate different kinds of development scenarios. We can build that into capacity expansion models when we're looking at renewable or the transmission lines that will be needed. There's a myriad of applications. I presented this as sort of a linear process that's very clean and clear. It's clearly not the case. And it's, a bunch of pretty little balls bouncing through a funnel. Now I want to go in and talk a little bit about, some of the projects that we've actually applied this. Just real quick, I want to note that sort of conceptual framework that I walked through is available in a report that we put out, and now a peer review publication that's just getting ready to be submitted that kind of maps some of these things out and lays out some of the examples. So you can check this out if you want. It's thick, but it's got a lot of good information in it. So I'm going to focus all of the conversations mostly on Europe and India, although I'll come back and give a little nod to the US since here we are in the US. We're focused um, on these countries or regions because they are top emitters and also because they've made significant commitments to renewable energy. Almost all of them across the board, greater than a gigaton of CO2 emission reductions that they're targeting by 2030. So first step, when we looked in within Europe, this is a breakout of high conflict land cover types. And so these differ for solar and wind. Solar includes agricultural land and also natural land cover types. Wind's mostly focused on natural land cover types because it integrates really nicely with agriculture. It's not a complete land use displacement as solar is, at least the way solar is being built currently. We could talk a little bit about agrivoltaics if you want, but this is the pattern. We see a lot of development that's happening on these higher land cover types. We also have the context, which I think is policy context is really important. Within the EU has this Repower initiative. One of the components of that is a mandate to all EU member states to design renewable energy go-to areas. So each country has to go through a spatial planning exercise in order to identify lower conflict sites. The guidance on it is very high level and pretty vague. So our focus has been on helping to try to think about how to prioritize which countries really need to dig in. And then also to start to work in some of the countries to help them create the models that then can be replicated. So the first step of this was just a EU-wide assessment. The first piece of that was really understanding where the solar and wind resources are. So create a development constraint map and estimate the resource potential and yield in terms of gigawatt hours. So if you looked at, if I put a wind turbine here, how much energy could I generate versus here? And what were the other constraints? Obviously, access to transmission, proximity to load centers can be really important. We then created a conflicts index, which looks based primarily on land use land cover, although incorporates Natura 2000 sites, which are quasi-protected areas, as well as protected areas. Um, and then we established a series of development scenarios. And so first were targets that were set by three pathways from a energy group in Europe called EMBER. And I won't go into the details of these, the stated policy, technology-driven, and system change. They're all sort of a little bit higher ramp up as you go from stated policy to system change in terms of how much renewables might be built, where rooftop versus ground-based. And we focus just on ground-based solar and obviously ground and onshore wind. And then we had two scenarios. The first was a business as usual, which really just uses the development potential and says, what if development tries to maximize that return on investment in terms of development potential? The other was using the development potential, but preferentially pushing it towards lower conflict land cover types. We took those targets and we took those scenarios and we took the goals and we met those goals by putting wind and solar on the ground. And then we assessed what land cover types and what the impacts look like associated with those different scenarios. So first thing, which is again, as I mentioned earlier, consistently, whether we're looking globally or regionally, there's always an abundance of lower conflict land cover types. And this just shows it for 2030 and 2035. If we look at 2050, there's still a lot of room to maneuver in terms of those projections. So in the hashing is how much space it would take to meet those targets. And the total green is the total resource available on lower conflict lands. So a lot of room to maneuver and where and how we place that on the ground. But when we look at the business as usual, purple in this case is overlap with high conflict lands. For solar, it appears as if the majority of the development would target these lower conflict or higher conflict land cover types, which is not what we want to see. Again, given that flexibility, we're not seeing the reality of that play out both from past patterns and based on our future projections. Similar for wind, although a little less dramatic, and it varies country by country. So but still a lot of purple, a lot of potential for overlap with high conflict land cover types. For wind, we can actually start to look at what that looks like. In the high conflict land cover types, a lot of forest cover, both broadleaf forests and coniferous forests. That would be taking, taking the largest chunk of some of those future wind footprints. So not exactly great. And in many cases, I think we underestimated what the impact is because we're primarily looking at the direct footprint. And really the way wind is having an impact on natural cover types is through fragmentation. And as I said, I think we're underestimating that impact based on how we scaled our footprints. But we can start to use that data, which we are, to look at how development, how we might prioritize those countries. So on the axis, we are looking at the footprint of current solar installations and then our projections of, of, of future development. And we're kind of highlighting this upper right-hand quadrant. And so two of the countries that we're working in right now actively are Portugal and Croatia, where we have projects to try to downscale some of these analyses, work with a lot of stakeholders to sort of bring it to bear. Same for wind. Again, we're looking at the current footprint development and the projection of future development. And again, just showing you where Portugal and Croatia are touching down. I just did a Fulbright fellowship in Croatia, spent a bunch of time working with the national and county level governments to sort of walk some of these analyses down. And this is just one county. It's a hotbed of tourism. It's Zadar County. And just that one county alone has enough wind and solar, and we are pretty aggressively screened out wind and solar areas that had good suitability, but maybe only moderate conflict to identify these places, but could meet almost 52% of the entire country's target. Obviously, not all the development's going to happen in Zadar County. But one of the things that it really that brought forward, which I'll try to emphasize as we go forward, is just the importance of these local community engagements. And as I said earlier, the biggest hurdle is going to be finding these places where communities will buy into development. Both in the US and in Europe, there are consulting firms that you can hire as local communities that will help you stop renewable energy projects. So we need to figure out ways to keep that from happening and engage communities early on so that they're bought into some of the development patterns. So I want to jump to India. Again, India is a top emitter and has aggressive renewable energy targets. So to 2030, they're looking to build 500 gigawatts of new wind and solar, about 80%, or I'm sorry, 500 gigawatts of renewable energy. About 80% of that will be wind and solar. It's roughly 47 gigawatts a year, and that's mind-boggling if you think about the scale and footprint of that. And India is one of the most crowded places on the planet. So we did a projection in a couple of years back now, looking at their 2022 targets, and estimated that about 1 million hectares of forest and 500 million hectares of agricultural land could be impacted. The latter really starts to bring that home for local communities. When we looked at current patterns of development, again, using Global Renewables Watch, the tool, again, that I mentioned that we built with Microsoft and Planet, for solar, we're seeing a lot of it built on agricultural land. The way it's being built now, it's a complete land use displacement. So it was ag, or it was whatever it was. They're coming in and they're putting solar on top of that. And so we're not growing any agricultural products associated with the solar farms. The developers there want to grow electrons. They don't want to grow strawberries and electrons. They want to put electrons into the grid. So that's a significant issue. Wind, a little bit better. It does hit agricultural land, but we don't see that as a big issue because it doesn't replace it might reduce it slightly, but doesn't completely replace it. And then there were some natural habitats that were impacted, primarily forests on hillsides and hilltops, which is another issue we could talk about perhaps. India is, as I said, complicated. One of the big issues in India is the Great Indian Bustard. There are only a handful of the birds left, and they are in their primary habitat is in Rajasthan, which is one of the best both resource potentials for wind and solar. And it's got wind that blows at a time when other renewables don't tend to. So it makes it really choice. It was taken to the Supreme Court, all the way through the courts, and the Supreme Court laid down a ban. A big swath of the state was taken off the table for both new renewable energy development as well as new transmission. A lot of that was a little bit of an overreaction, largely because there wasn't this kind of planning process in place to help guide the conflicts over development. Social issues, though, are probably the biggest component. And there's a all these are just newspaper headlines, sorry, that pulled just to give you a sense of that this is an active issue in India. Um, Communities are vocal, unlike biodiversity. They can be very vocal and they can protest and they can push back. One of the tricky aspects in India and local communities are the fact that there are things that are referred to as common lands. They're basically lands that are owned or managed or owned, I guess is probably the better word, by government. But local communities have been dependent on them for thousands of years, but they don't have rights to those lands. So government can permit the development of renewable energy without a really strong consultation process with those local communities. So that's a key issue that we're trying to address. So when we started this process off about 5 or 6 years ago, um, we convened a bunch of different working groups, brought a bunch of folks together to really help us understand what were some of the issues in India around renewable energy. So a lot of the usual suspects for on the environmental side. So protected areas, tiger corridors. Tiger corridors are, tigers are the draw in India for tourism in a lot of cases. Things like forest cover, important bird areas, key biodiversity areas. Areas with high reforestation potential. The Indian government has made a commitment to as part of its NDC, not just to build a lot of renewables, but also to restore their forests. So areas with high reforestation potential, we didn't want to see conflicts between those two NDC commitments. Other natural areas such as grasslands, which have been highly converted, not unlike in the US. Grasslands globally are the most converted, least protected biome. Threatened and endangered species. So we built a lot of local species distribution models, as opposed to just pulling, global models just to sort of bring in that local context. And we continue to refine those at a state scale. The big issue was really how local communities were dependent on land and access to land. So, we looked at things like rain-fed agriculture, unirrigated agriculture, livestock holdings per household, the percentage of common land, which again means that disconnect between government and local communities, percentage of households that use grass or thatch or bamboo or wood or mud as a building material, the availability of markets, the availability of paved roads, the distance from the town centers that ultimately markets and things would be sold in. So all those things become really important. We also included things like the scheduled caste population and the scheduled tribal populations, both which represent communities that tend to not have a lot of a voice in decision-making processes given historic discrimination, essentially. And so those are all the pieces that we brought together. All these things go into a tool that we refer to as SiteRight. And I encourage you to check it out. It's a really a cool tool, built in partnership with Vasuda Foundation, Foundation for Ecological Security, and CSTEP. CSTEP is almost like NREL is in the US. FES, or Foundation for Ecological Security, is like the premier community-based conservation organization, and Vasuda is a climate change focused organization in India. 3 modules: awareness module, site assessment module, and planning. Just real quick look at these. The awareness module is just that. It lets basically people understand what the potential impacts might be with a business as usual development scenario, and then also see opportunities for lower conflict land at a state level. So the national level targets are broken out by a state level, and it's really those states where the rubber hits the road. So the states have to translate those national targets into actionable plans on the ground. And so this is just the starting point. This is just showing a screenshot from the 2022 targets. It's updated or being updated now for 2030 and 2050 targets. So we'll be able to see those patterns. The site assessment tool is kind of also self-explanatory. If you're a developer, you can go into, you can choose a state, you can choose a district within the state, and you can upload a shapefile just by dragging it and throwing it on the screen. Or you can draw a polygon, and it'll give you a feedback or a report back of all of the environmental and social values within that area. And you can run multiple sites, so you can do comparisons of sites across the board. It's meant to be a pre-screening tool for either developers who have projects or the states that are ultimately thinking about where they might place auctions or bids or how they might achieve the renewable energy targets the state's trying to do. The planning module, I think, is the one is really is cool as someone who does this kind of work. So it uses the data in the assessment module, so those environmental values, and and runs an optimization. So basically, we build a predictive model that uses the locations of current wind and solar arrays, looks at where the wind resources are, where the renewable energy infrastructure is, like transmission and substations, and then builds a predictive model that says these are the potential for renewable energy development. It then within those high areas is taking the environmental data and selecting sites that meet the needs for renewable energy but are lower conflict in terms of environmental social data. And it does this, really quickly. So you can go into a district and you can say, find me, options for 250 megawatts of solar or for wind, runs the analysis, and it, spits that back out to you in under a minute and gives you a set of selected sites that meet those criteria and tells you a little bit about them. You can then also run the assessment of those sites based on the data in the site assessment module just to see what's there. Again, just want to emphasize that this, check it out. It's really cool and fun to play with. And it became really clear that it was needed. It's being used at the state level by state governments. It's being used by developers. Within the last, couple of years, we've seen it really take off. I think the learnings particularly from India and this project I'm going to talk about next, really made it really clear how important it was for us to consider what the communities need. So I just want to end on a little quick discussion of ways and things that we're thinking about. I will say for sure we haven't cracked yet. We have 2 postdocs right now that are really thinking about how to map social and cultural values and bring them into some of these decision support tools. These are just a bunch of newspaper articles that kind of highlight the conflicts over social values. A bias towards this is from one of Aishwarya's presentations a month or so back in Portugal. So it was focused a lot on the US but in particular Europe. But again, these issues I think are the biggest hurdle that we have to overcome. So I'm going to took us all the way from Europe, India, back to the US, and you probably recognize this landscape. It's West Texas. And this is a project that I was involved with hopefully a bunch of people that are in the room. I'll give them a shout out in a second. This project, I think, emphasized from the very beginning, really having engagements with local communities, but also I think the Texas community writ large. I think everyone considers West Texas to be Texas's playground, and so there was a lot of work brought into this to do phone surveys, to do online surveys, and then as we move forward to really engage with those local communities at a county level. What we came up with was a set of things that those communities really said, these define our our values and what we care about in our, why we want to live here. And so those are things that we built into each of the, into the analysis, focused on a 3-county area. And this is sort of a quickie overview of that process I'll talk you through. But again, just want to, hopefully Melinda Taylor and Michael Young are in the audience. Would also give a shout out to David Ionelli, who I think did a lot, his group did a lot of the surveys at the state and West Texas scale. And then Lewis Harvison, who's also played a really big role. Kei Soshi led this, did all the GIS and all the analysis, and slogged through all this. But basically taking those ideas of the way people define values and turning them, translating them into spatial data, into maps that can be built to identify areas of high value and areas of lower value. And that includes, again, these are all the sort of environmental data sets and some of the social data sets like viewsheds, hunting, managed areas, trails, all those things to try to bring that in. It was I think, a really fantastic process. It also is eye-opening to me because I think what it really reveals is going back to that, my opening statement about how we are really failing to fund what's needed to address climate change. And this is one of those things. We're going to need renewable energy. We're going to need the investment in the planning to figure out where it goes and how communities will accept it. Without it, I think the renewable energy transition will stagnate and it'll slow, and it'll be difficult. One of the tools, and I'm just going to throw this out as an idea, it's something we used in Zadar County. We're trying to use it in Portugal by screening first environmental values to identify lower conflict areas, then going in there and seeing whether communities would be comfortable. Just because we made some maps that said, hey, these are low conflict, we really have to understand what the communities want and would be comfortable with. And so, we could go to the traditional route and hold town hall meetings and try to, bring people in, send surveys out. So one of the ways we're trying to serve them is through PPGIS, or public participation GIS. So we create some mapping tools that are relatively easy to use, that you can use on your phone or you can use on the web, where we ask you, where would you want to see development or where would you not want to see development, and allow them to start to help us understand where those conflict or lower conflict areas are. Sort of a hierarchical approach using desktop data and then walking it down as much as we can to local scales. I am going to stop talking. I think everyone will be happy with that. These are just some resources that if you want to see some of the work, dive in a little bit more, you can. So that's it for me. Thanks for your attention.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Joe. Thanks very much. Yeah, we have kind of a few questions here in terms of based upon your talk. One, you obviously kind of just showed maps and talked about land use here, and there's a question about how does the concept of water or freshwater access and how that affects land values come into here. So I'm assuming that, water influences the value of different areas of land, but is there something more you can say about how people think about water as opposed to just land and this kind of planning for which areas are low impact?
Yep. So, I am by training, a freshwater ecologist, and most of my research in my academic life when I was a professor was on amphibians. And so, the things that are wet and moist are near and dear to my heart. I don't make a distinction between freshwater systems and terrestrial systems. They're linked, you can't separate them out. You can't break them apart. The terrestrial systems depend on freshwater systems and vice versa. I'll give you an example in how we brought those into the mix. In West Texas, springs, wetlands, those were burned into our high value areas because it's a dry, it's an arid system. Water is precious, and that was, clear from the stakeholders that those are going to be included and brought into the mix. I would say similar kinds of things in India where, India is a boom bust In terms of moisture, there's the monsoons, which create a lot of the freshwater systems, and then there's no rain, and it gets hotter before the monsoons come back. And so freshwater systems are also critically important. And in our analyses, they were also burned in as critical. And we don't in many cases, I think we don't understand with respect to solar and wind whether they're gonna have an impact or not. But I think in many cases we tried the precautionary principle where we were like, okay, it's a land use change. We don't want to see impacts particularly to freshwater systems. So we're going to be cautious and at minimum highlight those in terms of impacts. One of the things that India is thinking a bunch about are what we refer to as photovoltaics. So putting solar panels on artificial water bodies. The problem in India is that everything pretty much is an artificial water body. If you go back far enough in time, um, almost all the lakes, all of the things that hold water are, might have been a couple thousand years ago, but they were, they weren't there previously. So a lot of the natural systems that have evolved as a response to those changes are what's left of freshwater species. They become dependent on those. So it's a little bit of a tug and war in India to sort of bring some of that understanding into the mix. Newer developments, India is also building a lot of hydropower. So a lot of those hydropower dams will have reservoirs. And because they're new, those are the places that I think we're trying to get the government to prioritize. The other, I think, nice part of that is that you already have the infrastructure built to evacuate the electrons because you have a hydropower plant there. You can also do some, pump storage, so you can use the solar power to pump water back over the dam and, provide that sort of storage for when it's needed to match the peak demand times. That was a little bit more than I think the question asked, but hey, I took the liberty. I answer the questions I want.
Right, there you go. Well, sounds similar to Texas. I think we're quoted as having only one natural lake, or major lake. So, um, there's a question early on. Most of obviously what you're talking about is land and biodiversity. Was there anything put into the tools and methods that you talked about regarding, I guess, knowledge? This person's asking regarding knowledge. I'm not sure if that's knowledge about skill level for renewable energy and these kinds of things. Has this kind of more economic side been kept out of the methods you've been talking about, or is that kind of integrated in any way, like skill
Yeah.
level, economic development? Yeah.
Yeah. So, I, for first, I would say in terms of economics, the predictive models that look at development potential are considering what is ultimately an economic driver, right? So, proximity to transmission lines is going to make a development project cheaper than one that's farther away, and the developers or the government have to invest in building those transmission lines. So, to some degree, those components are built in. We're also looking at the places where the wind speeds and solar iridescence are optimal so that, again, they're going to maximize production. So that's part of it. There's other pieces, I think, where that's happening. We're also looking at, and I think this is sort of a new wrinkle for the work in India, um, looking at how we can target local communities. Energy poverty is a big issue in India. Um, a lot of households still use biomass for fuel wood or in many cases for lighting, although kerosene lamps and things like that are becoming more um, common or more commonplace. But looking at how electricity can help improve both indoor air quality, but also address some of the energy poverty issues, and at the same time provide jobs and opportunities for those local communities. So some of those are pieces that we're trying to bring in, trying to do something similar in Europe by looking at the the ratio of household income and energy expenses. Again, as a way that can entice local communities to want to become, they want to attract renewable energy development to their backyards. If there's a way to share in energy access, but also perhaps reduce energy costs for those local communities. They have to bear the burden of having the development in their backyard. Can they also get a reduction in their energy bills? And again, we're looking at those as ways to target those communities. So ones that are spending a disproportionate amount on their energy bills, essentially.
Right. Okay, thank you. Here's one sort of dives into the political tad, I suppose, but essentially as a scientist, and you're sort of discussing these scientific tools you've created that have a little bit of an economic flair to them, as you just described. Are you worried, according to the question here, are you worried about the idea of weaponization of use of these tools to enhance opposition campaigns against renewable energy, in the sense that, hey, you've given a tool for the good areas, if you will, or the low conflict areas for renewable energy development, and now you've sort of told people who don't want renewable energy, oh, come up with some other restriction that now would prevent even from those areas from being used. So how do you think about that? Maybe that's a broader question of TNC philosophy. Do you just say, well, get the science out there, and then there's other questions, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, no, it's a tough one. Normally when I give one of these, I always have one of my colleagues in the audience, and my um, statement is I take all the easy questions and they'll take all the hard questions. This is a hard question.
Yeah.
But I would say part of our philosophy is that we feel like the more information people have to make decisions, the better. And so, we recognize the risk of, in some cases, of putting that information out there. You're right. I think in the US and in Europe, I think it's going to be tricky because like, as I said earlier, there are consulting companies that you can hire that can help stop projects. So if you're a local community, you see that your area is quote unquote low conflict and high potential, technical potential, that might kick off them getting organized to stop renewable energy development. That's a risk, totally. One of the other risks that we're seeing in places like India is are land grabs. So you have people who then go out and see uh, that there's value in land ownership, and will start to purchase parcels and prepare, for when that development comes, they can consolidate and perhaps sell at a higher cost. Usually what that results in is the local communities, those local landowners, which are living, in many cases at the margins of poverty, losing out and not sharing in some of those benefits that could occur. So there's risks. I think at the end of the day, you know, um, I don't want to say TNC has come to a conclusion on this. And see, there's no one voice from TNC. It's a very complex organization with lots of components of the organization. But from my perspective, I think the way we're going to address this and we're going to facilitate the transition is from this forward-looking planning. We can't do development the way we've done it in the past, which is one project at a time. It's going to take way too long, and it's not going to keep us in step and in pace what we need to hit the emission reduction targets. So there's risks, but I feel like from my personal perspective, the rewards outweigh the risks. Making those investments in putting this information out. And there's a variety of ways. Texas is a tricky place. Because it's all public land, and public landowners can pretty much do whatever they want.
Private, it's mostly private land.
Private, yeah, I'm sorry. Oh,
Yeah.
wow. Major faux pas. And so, so there has to be, a carrot to make this come together. And I think part of that is trying to appeal to the developers. The other part is also, I think, thinking about how transmission will be built and investments in where transmission will occur, so that it helps facilitate and promote development in some of these lower conflict areas. That's not going to happen unless we get some of this information out there, get it vetted, get it socialized. So it's a risk, but I think it's an important one.
Right. Well, people on the webinar are probably familiar with at least a bit of transmission planning in Texas history with the competitive renewable energies zones, but I'm not sure if this kind of land use and biodiversity aspect and social aspects I'm not sure how much they were considered in that. as opposed to just where it's windy. So maybe step one, at least out of your 5-step process. There's a question on just you presented somewhat different areas, the United States, West Texas, or European Union, and then West Texas and India. Have you learned anything about how people think when you approach them with these ideas? Is it one of these deals where, well, everybody's kind of the same when you actually approach them and they are interested in the same areas of, clean water and nice livelihood or this, or are there some differences in how people responded to this kind of approach?
Yeah. I mean, I think the one universal um, is that people want to be engaged. These are big societal decisions that is gonna drive a lot of change. And, I think a lot of small communities, I would say, certainly in particular rural communities, which are ultimately going to have to be saddled with the changes that are ultimately going to benefit the urban environments and larger population centers, right? I think that's how a lot of people see it. And so to be engaged, to have a seat at the table, I think is the one universal that people want. That requires, it's easy, I think, to step back, sit down and create a map or model of our first two steps. Like, where's the wind blow? Where does the sun shine? Where's the transmission? Oh, these are the places that we can develop. It's a lot harder to bring in those values. I don't think the environmental values are the hard part, and I don't think that they will be the biggest hurdle. I think it will be the social piece. And in a lot of places where um, there is a lot of private land, you can't just make obviously you can't make decisions about where development can go without that engagement. And so that's the one universal is that I think people tend to want that engagement. But that makes it hard. And the investment we're going to need to step this down state by state, county by county is a big challenge. But
Right.
that's the level of investment that's has to be made.
Right. Is the social aspect the sort of largest challenge to getting people to focus on the low conflict areas that you developed environmentally? It's just finding a way for social acceptance in those areas.
Yep, I do. And I think that's how we're kind of right now envisioning it is it's a series of hierarchical filters. You start with the things like the energy and then, legal constraints and then the environmental stuff. And then you have a set of sites that you can use some desktop data to start to get at social values. But at the end of the day, you've got to engage at that scale in order to get acceptance and buy-in. And like I said, the one universal is that there's a lot of flexibility in where and how this can happen. So that's a positive. But if we want the pace to stay on track, yeah, I think it's going to be those investments in really engaging those local communities.
It's maybe outside of your wheelhouse again in terms of the social aspects, but there's a question related to just, examples of overcoming social opposition and assisting renewable energy or perhaps even transmission lines build out and references to areas that seem perhaps beneficial for economic or environmental reasons, but if you have one landowner that owns a lot of land that has to get appeased and doesn't want it, then maybe that's too hard to overcome. Do you have any insight in terms of that? If it's, multiple landowners and smaller land parcels are easier than fewer landowners and large land parcels, or depends on the person, I guess.
Well, it depends, right? And I know that they're really unfortunate. So if I was a developer, and we see this in India, um, the data on land ownership is really difficult to get your hands on. But what you can get your hands on is sort of the parcel sizes of land. And so the last thing a lot of developers want to deal with is having to, work out an agreement with 150 landowners, right? So, they may have a place that's just perfect in terms of resource potential, access to transmission, and even in some cases the environmental values and or social values. But there's tons of small parcels and land fragments that they would have to go through the process of signing separate agreements with each of those landowners. They tend to shy away from that. You actually see a similar kind of situation in some of the countries in Europe where, over time, where land was maybe a large parcel, and as people passed away and passed it on to their heirs and their heirs passed it on to their heirs, things tended to get split up. And there are lots of places where these small fragments of land, which is a flip side because there's an opportunity in those because they, in many cases, have limited, if any, economic viability from a farming perspective because they're so small that you can actually target those as individual parcels that then you can work out agreements with the landowners who would be eager because they're like, well, I've got this, you know, tiny chunk parcel of land that my dad left me that was his grandfather's and his grandfather's. And so there's an opportunity to, so there are different contexts. I'm not going to say there's a general rule that fits all, but there are ways, I think, to think through some of this with people who are knowledgeable of the land systems and the land local context.
Right. Okay, well, I'll end on this one here. It's a little on the education scale. I'm not sure what scale the person is referring to, but I'll sort of read the question. Do you have student programs to familiarize students? I guess that's person saying at all levels, maybe different education levels of the science or the techniques or use of these tools. I mean, I know at the universities, then people are learning these techniques, assessing biodiversity, water resources, GIS, all these techniques, but maybe at lower levels introducing people to these ideas. Does TNC run any kind of programs like this or?
So yeah, I guess the our target though are the people that are ultimately doing the planning and permitting the development. So there's always a big focus on capacity building within the countries in order to either use the data that we've created or to be able to modify and do the analyses themselves. Those can be at the government, within the state agencies or national agencies that are ultimately, again, in the driver's seat for permitting. That's a big component of our focus. The other are, in many cases, there are consulting companies that are ultimately doing analyses for developers or in some cases for government. And so, targeting them again in terms of making sure they understand the data that we have, understand how they can use it and access it. It's a free, typically a free resource. I think everybody loves free. And so, bringing them into the fold because they also drive a lot of um, the the development processes. They are often behind the scenes, but in the lead on doing an environmental impact assessment for a project. So having them understand that, be able to pre-screen projects before they come to the conversation about permitting is, I think, really important. We often work a ton with university partners. Um, and, I was a professor before I came to TNC at Penn State and I'm an adjunct at a, couple universities. And so I still try to take some of this and bring it into that educational setting. I would say, we're right now not formally um, trying to, have a focused outreach program that would target uh, universities, but with something we've kicked around. We've done this enough, and we obviously can't jump from country to country and place to place to do this all over the world. And one of our focuses is try to get the focus for other conservation NGOs to start to convene some of these things and bring some of this process forward, and or other actors like universities or um, other entities that are already in this mix.
Do you have any insight or estimation of, I guess, just how much time or person power is used to bring, let's just say your target audience of kind of local officials? I don't know how local, they're state or they're sort of sub-state county type levels in India or something, for example, you show up for a week with a team and
Wow.
help people through it, or how does that work?
Yeah, I would, that's a tricky one. I'd love if Michael or Melinda were on. They could chime in on how much time we spent in West Texas.
Yeah.
In India, it's a mixed situation and it really varies state to state. So we've been working there with probably oh, maybe three, quite not, yeah, around maybe three full-time people um, focused in India over the last maybe close to 5 years, maybe 4 years. And that includes the science and analysis, the building of the tools, and a lot of it is the outreach and stakeholder outreach, which is all done by our local partners. And so the funds that's just TNC. TNC's we're raising money that supports some of those other partners like CSTEP and FES and Vasuda to do some of that outreach and bring some of that input. So, there's a handful of people that are working there as well. Like I said, it's really context dependent at a local scale about how much engagement has to be done in order to get buy-in and get the feedback that we need. So it's a really tough one.
Right. Okay, well, thank you. We'll end it there. So thank you very much. Joe Kiesecker, lead scientist of the Nature Conservancy. Thanks for speaking with us at the UT Energy Symposium.
My pleasure. Appreciated it.